Good morning, students. We have been seeing in this chapter of Three Orders how the society of Europe was changing over the ninth and 10th and 11th and the 12th century. How agriculture, of course, being very, very important, but then still the whole ecosystem of agriculture was changing around it, right? When it started as hunter gatherers, and then it became, the whole agriculture was concentrated and the agricultural activity was concentrated around manorial states. And then how, as the town started evolving and more people started shifting towards the town, how even that uh, power equation changed. Okay, so today we start the topic of cathedral towns. Now, first we need to understand what are cathedrals. Cathedrals would be essentially, if you look at into a very common definition of it, they are massive churches which are huge. Okay, and that is what we call cathedrals. Okay, you see churches all around you in Missouri and Dehradun also. There are large churches, but cathedrals are something else. Cathedrals would be massive churches. Okay, huge churches. So I wonder if you have cathedrals in Dehradun or even Uttarakhand for that matter, because they are massive churches, huge churches, and they have massive campuses, that kind of stuff. So one of the ways that rich merchants spent their money was by making donation to churches. From the 12th century, large churches called cathedrals were built in France. These belonged to monasteries, but different groups of people contributed to the construction with their own labor, material, or money. Cathedrals were built of stone and took many years to complete. As they were being built, the area around the cathedrals became more and more populated, and when they were completed, they became centers of pilgrimage. The small towns developed around them. Guys, even in India for that matter, since time immemorial, for thousands of years, we all know that there are many towns in India which owe their origin and which owe their growth and prosperity to the gods or some major religious figure. What would be Varanasi without its gods and the myth of Lord Shiva, who is considered to be there himself, or Dwarka for that matter, the place of Lord Krishna, or Mathura, or Vrindavan, and Somnath. And then you talk about, when you go to south, then you would talk about places like Madurai, or Chidambra, and then there's so many places which owe everything to the gods there. Vaishno Devi, and there are plenty. Ujjain, again Lord Shiva. Calcutta, Goddess Kali. You cannot, talk about these places without mentioning about the great gods. If you go to Guwahati, Goddess Kamakhya. The list goes on and on in India, and. And just like in India for thousands of years, it was the same story even in Europe, where the rich and nobility and the aristocracy would it would actually contribute enormous amount of money as charity for the construction of these cathedrals. Like in India, you must have also seen a lot of people uh, who might not like to spend any amount of money on themselves, but would contribute crores and crores of rupees for the fancy temple which would be built somewhere, and they would contribute lakhs of rupees to some gurdwara which would be built somewhere else. So that is how it is in India, and it was the same story in other parts of the world as well. And this is what is being told here, that the whole because as I told you, cathedrals are massive churches, so naturally they took enormous amount of time to build. So when they were being built, you can understand there would be hundreds of laborers who would be working, contractors, then the people who would be supervising all that money, the contribution. So naturally small towns actually started evolving and developing around these cathedrals while they were even being built, and by the time they were completed, you had a full-fledged town. And Europe is full of these places, like the cathedrals. They have the cathedrals, and the whole world kind of develops around them. Cathedrals were designed so that the priest's voice could be heard clearly within. And students, one very important thing: the location of these cathedrals were not chosen in random. That suddenly you feel that there should be a cathedral in probably right in the middle of Rajpur Road or right in the center of Masuri Mall Road. No, yeah, the locations are not chosen randomly. Okay, there has to be a great religious significance about that place. Maybe some saint is buried there, or at some point in time some great saint had been there. He might have lived there for probably 5 or 10 years, and those areas and those particular locations become significantly important from the religious perspective or the point of view. And then probably some years later, or maybe centuries later, some people feel that yes, we should be having a cathedral here, we should build a cathedral here, and then the whole thing kind of is set into motion. So, cathedrals were designed so that the priest's voice could be heard clearly within the hall where large number of people gathered, and so that the singing by monks could sound beautiful, and the chiming bells called people to prayer could be heard over great distance. Stained glass was used for windows. During the day, the sunlight would make them radiant for people inside the cathedral, and after sunset, the light of the candles would make them visible to people outside. The stained glass windows narrated the stories in the Bible through pictures which illiterate people could read. Actually, and the intention was not just that to have a great and a great monument of affection and love towards Lord Jesus Christ, or towards the great saint who had been probably living there, but also to ensure that there were a lot of students. These were the places where it was not just the fact that you used to go for the prayers. No, we all know that whether you talk about temples or churches or gurdwaras, these are also centers of very, very important events in the life of common people. People get married there. People, once they died, their last visit to church is important. Their last visit to these places of religious significance is important. People get married. People, once a child is born, he is taken there for the father to so that the father can bless him. So all these events are important. And marriages also take place in these churches and these cathedrals. And if you must have watched it in the movies as well. Marriages happen in our temples, marriages happen in these churches as well. So these places just not there that you open the doors only to pray to the gods, but it is also a great center of religious discussion, religious discourses, marriages, birth of children, death, all of that. So you have to understand it is same in all the cultures. It's not just in India, where you have massive temples which cater to different kinds of activities within the society, and but along with definitely the devotion towards the god. It was not just in India, it is a global phenomenon. The crisis of the 14th century. The By the early 14th century, Europe's economic expansion slowed down. This was due to three factors. In Northern Europe, by the end of 13th century, the warm summers of the previous 300 years had given way to bitterly cold summers. If you remember, we had come across uh, this situation where we had studied, I think, in the previous video, where I had mentioned that the climate was comparatively warm in the 11th and 12th century, which really facilitated the growth of crops and the abundant crop growth at that point in time. Because even the countries like Germany and the countries like Austria, which normally were, which we all know are very cold countries, they had comparatively warmer climatic conditions. England, so they, which naturally facilitated farming and crop growth. But this time, those areas again started getting very, very cold, and naturally the crops were difficult to come by. The crops were not that successful as they used to be, as they had been for last 200, 300 years. Seasons for growing crops were reduced by a month, and naturally, students, you have to understand that the time span where you have abundant sunshine, that duration definitely started shrinking, because you now have longer spans of cold winters. Storms and oceanic flooding destroyed many farmsteads. Now, what are farmsteads? Farmlands, right? Where जहाँ पे आप किसानी करते हैं. But farmsteads, that fields, जहाँ पे आप खेत जिसको आप कहते हैं, एंड जहाँ पे आप फसल उगाते हैं. बट farmstead would be a place whereby it's not just the land where you are where you are cultivating crops and plowing and all of that, but it is also a place where you have your houses. You would have it's almost like there would be 10 or 15 houses, farmsteads, 10, 15 large houses where you could be having greenery, then you would be having your own houses. It's not that you have a house somewhere else and your land is somewhere else, like it happens in most of the times. Or probably you just have one hut which is there, but one hut would not be known as a farmstead, please. Okay, so you would have a group of homes, and that is known as farmsteads, which resulted in less income and taxes for government. So naturally, when there was a crop failure, the governments couldn't impose taxes, and definitely their economic revenue took a hit. The opportunities offered by favorable climate conditions before the 13th century had led to large-scale reclamation of land of forest and pastures for agriculture. But intensive plowing had exhausted the soil despite the practice of the three-field rotation of crops, because the clearance was not accompanied by proper soil conservation. The shortage of pasturage reduced the number of cattle. The population growth was overstripping resources, and the immediate result was famine. Several famines hit Europe between 1315 and 1317, followed in the 1320s by massive cattle deaths. Guys, essentially just trying to tell you that because of the comparative warmer climates during those 200, 300 years, a lot of area had been brought under farming. Even the forest land had been brought under farming. Many, many trees had been chopped so that the farming land could be expanded. Okay, but you have to understand that when the crops are bountiful, then your animals also have plentiful to eat around them. There are a lot of grasses, and there's a lot of crops and all that. So there was no scarcity of food for them. But once the crop started failing, and you have those many, many animals, now where would they go to feed? Because they don't have much to eat now as well, because humans themselves found it difficult to barely meet their requirements. So naturally the animals got neglected, and many, many cattle started dying at that point in time, because there wasn't much for them to even eat. Because now you had a situation where you had huge tract of land under farming, but there was nothing growing there. So it was all barren land. So you can understand how would the animals survive now. The worst was yet to come. In addition, trade was hit by severe shortages of metal money because of the shortfall in the output of silver mines in Austria and Serbia. This forced governments to reduce the silver content of the currency and to mix it with cheaper metals. The worst was yet to come. As trade expanded in the 13th and 14th centuries, the ships carrying goods from distant countries had started arriving in European ports. Along with the ships came rats, carrying the deadly bubonic plague infection. Guys, that is what it is. If you ask someone in Missouri from say 1970, someone who was there in 1970, or even for that matter in the early 1980s, he would tell